to the room and have more of our staff to be a part of our meetings as they were before. So thank you for that, whoever idea that was. So at this time, I am going to call the meeting to order, and we'll begin this afternoon's meeting. Because we have guests, we'll just start from our right, beginning with the CMS board chair, and we'll go around the dais.
Good evening, or good afternoon. I followed your lead, Chairman Dunlap. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Elise Dashew, and I have the privilege of chairing the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education, and I serve at large.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having us. My name is Frank Barnes. I am the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools Chief Equity and Accountability Officer.
Good afternoon, Chairman Dunlap, Vice Chair Powell, and Commissioners. I'm Ernest Winston, Superintendent of Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools.
Good afternoon. My name is Sabrina Harris. I serve as the Executive Director of Budget and Management Services.
Good afternoon. I'm Adrian Cox. I'm the Budget Director for Mecklenburg County.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Jarrell, and I've been elected by the people of District 4.
Good afternoon. I am Elaine Powell, Mecklenburg County Commissioner for District 1, which is all of North Mecklenburg, and I also serve as Vice Chair.
Good afternoon again. My name is George Dunlap. I'm elected by the people of District 3, and I have the privilege of serving as chair of the board.
Good afternoon. My name is Lee Altman, Mecklenburg County Commissioner, serving at large.
Good afternoon. My name is Vilma D. Leak, and I represent the most powerful district in the county. Welcome.
Good afternoon. I'm Laura Meyer, and I represent District 5.
Good afternoon. I'm Susan Rodriguez McDowell, elected by the people of District 6.
Good afternoon. I'm Christine Smith, interim clerk.
Good afternoon, Tyrone Wade, County Attorney.
Good afternoon, Dina Diorio, Mecklenburg County Manager.
Okay, before we get started, well, I have it. Okay. Before we get started, there's some business we must attend to.
Scarborough.
And excuse me.
I'm sorry, I didn't know you. I didn't hear you. I heard you Scarborough.
She's getting through. He's getting through.
I'm sorry.
There's some business we need to address before we move to our meeting. Our rule states that when we're meeting publicly, if you're not publicly in the meeting, then you're not in attendance. Commissioner Scarborough is requesting to continue to meet remotely. I will just share with you that if we do it for one, it also has to be made available for all. So we will either abide by the rule that requires everybody to be public in attendance for your vote and attendance to account, or you are absent. So I need a motion one way or the other.
What was your statement, Mr. Dunlap? I really did not hear what you were saying, sir.
According to our rules, Ms. Scarborough cannot participate unless this board agrees to allow her to participate, because she is required to participate publicly.
Mr. Chairman, I move to approve allowing virtual presence.
Second.
It's been moved and properly seconded. So let's go to the roll call vote. We'll start with you, Commissioner McDowell.
Aye.
Commissioner Meyer.
Aye.
Commissioner Leak.
Yes.
Commissioner Altman.
Aye.
Commissioner Powell.
No.
Commissioner Jarrell.
Aye.
All right, Madam Clerk.
Motion carries 8-1.
All right.
Well, you don't have
7 to 1.
Didn't have the...
7 to 1. Okay. So
not here.
with that being said, then Commissioner Scarborough will be admitted into the meeting. Welcome, Commissioner Scarborough.
Thank you.
All right. So now, can we stand and pledge allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America
And to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. I also want to give this special notice for those who are desirous of attending our meeting. Due to the COVID-19 state of emergency, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Government Center is currently closed to the public. Members of the public can access and view the meeting on the government channel or online at watchmecnc.gov or on Twitter. The public can also listen online on YouTube, and agendas for the meeting can be found at mecklenburglegistar.com. Anyone wishing or needing special accommodations when attempting this meeting or the information is needed in an alternate format, please contact the clerk to the board. The board reserves the right to deviate from our agenda, just making sure that that's clear. All right, today's meeting is a special meeting between the Board of Commissioners and the Charlotte-Mecklenburg School Board. But before I move into that, I will call on our county manager.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't really have any opening statements except to turn the podium over to our superintendent or school board chair to start our presentation.
Thank you, County Manager Diorio, Mr. Chairman, Ms. Vice Chairperson, as well as Board of County Commissioners. Thank you all for the opportunity to speak this afternoon. We will, at this time, share with you all a brief presentation that was adopted by our Board of Education a week ago. And so joining me, we have our Chairwoman, Elise Dashew, on the far right. To my immediate right, we have Dr. Frank Barnes, our Chief Accountability and Equity Officer. And then to my left, immediate left, Ms. Sabrina Harris, who is our Executive Director of Budget. And so we're going to be presenting our 2021-2022 budget. Let me just do a quick sound check. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, wonderful. Yes. Thank you. And that budget will also include the request to Mecklenburg County. And then Dr. Barnes, following me, Dr. Barnes is going to provide an update on student performance in what has been one of the most challenging of years for both our students and our staff. And then he will also share updates on our efforts to progress monitor against our strategic plan and proposed reporting procedures to ensure transparency with members of our public. And then to close us out, Chairwoman Dashew will provide some closing remarks, and then the bulk of the session will be left open for an opportunity to answer any questions and have a dialogue. So if that meets with everyone's approval, I'd like to go ahead and dive right into the budget, Chairman Dunlap. What we present today is the result of a thorough review. You can go to the next one.
I'm not controlling it.
You're not controlling the clicker. I am happy. Thank you. Thank you. So this is the result of a very thorough review of our district needs, and after offering multiple feedback opportunities from our public, members of our public through multiple engagement sessions. And we conducted those sessions virtually due to the pandemic. As I transition, the next slide, please. We've heard from members of our community through those multiple opportunities that I just shared with you, and it is very clear. It's very clear to us that as we are hopefully rounding the corner with the COVID-19 pandemic and beginning to return to some sense of normalcy with more in-person instruction for our students, that our social and emotional needs and well-being of our students is top of mind for members of our community. As it is for us in the district as well. And so our budget makes that a priority. And we know that our students' social and emotional health has been impacted And we need to invest the resources that are necessary to help our students process the very real impacts of the pandemic. And so I want to emphasize a key element in our budget process. So throughout the development of the budget, we have relied on input from what we call our focus area teams. And these are staff members, a cross-functional team of staff members throughout our district, including those who are most proximate to students. But we've relied on those teams to make sure that our budget recommendation aligns with our strategic plan. And we believe that these recommendations that I will share will lead to improvement in outcomes for all students in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. And so when we look at the next slide, and we're not going to belabor this particular point, but we know that the pandemic, as you can see by the collage, has impacted every aspect of our lives. And so the budget that our Board of Education, led by Chairwoman Dashew, the budget that they voted to adapt was created with the impact of the pandemic front and center. And so we know that there were gaps that existed prior to the pandemic. And we know that those gaps have only deepened during the pandemic. And so our funding priorities are a direct result of how our schools have felt the impact of COVID-19. Here, what you will see on the next slide, and as I mentioned before, how our budget is aligned with our strategic plan. And you'll see the 3 goals on the left, in the middle, the targets, and the focus areas on the far right. And then to continue this on this particular theme, on the next slide, we know that every element and all priorities take into consideration one or more focus areas that we developed to help keep us moving toward equity of opportunity and improved educational outcomes for all of the students we're privileged to serve. And so as I transition to the next slide, where are we now? We know that this past year and a half have been among the most challenging in our lifetimes in almost every aspect. And we know we've seen some very visible impacts in terms of education. And we focused on protecting the safety and health of both our students and our staff. And I believe that we can claim some success in those areas. But having said that, we know that between difficulties for some students with remote learning and the previously mentioned social and emotional toll that the pandemic has taken, we know that those gaps that existed, as I mentioned prior to COVID, they've gotten deeper. And so just as broader community issues such as economic instability, food insecurity, and inequities in housing are more evident than ever before, students and families who face those challenges pre-pandemic, they face higher hurdles today. And so we know that at least 50,000 of our students are considered at risk of failing at least one course. And we must act now, we believe, to help students complete the unfinished learning. And we have almost 30,000 students who are registered for our Camp CMS Summer Enrichment Program, and I'm going to share a little bit more about that in a few moments. But we aim to help all of our students make up ground prior to the start of next school year. And we know that next school year will be here before you know it. As I transition to the first of several charts, that we will share with you this afternoon, and I won't spend a whole lot of time here, but as I've talked about, we know the challenges are significant, but I'll tell you that I believe my team that we have in place, our staff members led by our Board of Education, we're absolutely up to meeting those challenges that we're facing. And we also have a significant infusion of temporary funding from federal sources. And that funding has one purpose in mind, and that is to narrow the gaps that have been widened by the pandemic. And I'll say it now, and I will likely have to repeat several times, that while COVID-related funding is significant, it is significant because the immediate needs that we have are also significant. And so I will also emphasize that the temporary COVID funding that carries with it restrictions on how we can spend those dollars, how they must use. We must also apply COVID funding, for example, to the challenges caused or related directly to the pandemic. So I just wanted to share that, and I suspect that I will say that at least once or twice more. And as we transition to the next slide, we know that, and I want to take a moment to just kind of briefly walk you all through some of the COVID-related federal funding that we've received to help us recover ground that was lost during the pandemic. And so we're fortunate. We are extremely fortunate to have this infusion of resources. But we must emphasize that this funding is temporary. It's restricted to allocation for purposes that are directly related to COVID impacts and cannot be depended upon for ongoing needs in the district. And we know we're in a very unique time. We're in a very unique time, as we all know, due to COVID-19. But also unique to this time is the addition of multiple rounds of COVID-19 related funding. And this is new one-time funding. So I will share some details about these funds, including the amounts, the periods in which they are available, some of the allowable uses, as well as restrictions and requirements. And then we'll also share some details about investments that are planned for some of these new federal funds. So on the next slide, as a result of the pandemic, these emergency funds are, because we have not received all of these funds, but they are being sent to us, and we have received some, as well as other districts across the country. So if we look in the far left column, these are the CARES Act funds. And we use those to support a number of COVID-related needs this school year. We initially received the $33.6 million. Some of those funds went to leave pay, technology needs, HVAC, optimization, PPE, as well as ebooks and some other items. And then we received another $7.3 million in February of this year that was broken into some smaller grants with some very specific purposes. The two additional grants that you'll see, ESSER 2 as well as ESSER 3. And just for context, ESSER is short for Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Funds, but I will periodically, I'll refer to it as ESSER 2 or ESSER 3. And so the multi-year funds, as you can see in this particular chart, ESSER 2 is available through September of 2023, and ESSER 3 is available through September of 2024. And in terms of, again, these are meant to be in addition to our regular budget, not to replace any funding that we normally receive. And you might ask the question, well, why in addition to? So like I mentioned earlier, there have been significant impacts directly due to the pandemic, and it will take significant investment over the next several years. And so as we transition to our next slide, so why are we being provided these funds? As you know, these are obviously some significant amount of funds. But when I talk about the needs, we know those needs have been amplified. And we also know that there will continue to be amplified needs over the next several years as a result of this pandemic. And so the COVID emergency funds, they're intended to help us respond to this increased level of need. So next slide, please. So we will continue the work that we started in the district to move toward our strategic plan goals, but also respond to the increased needs of that were created by the pandemic. And on the far right, you'll see our strategic plan, What Matters Most. And in some cases, this will mean doubling down. We've got to double down or increase the level of what we had planned to do pre-pandemic. And in other cases, this is a short-term support to get us back on track as a school district. And so in the next slide, I want to just spend a few moments on some specific things about ESSER 2 and ESSER 3. So when we talk about allowable uses for these funds, there are a number of allowable uses for these funds, and we've sort of categorized those for you. Won't read those off, but there are a number of allowable uses that are specific to student learning needs, and you'll see what some of those includes. There are also a number of allowable uses for health and safety, as well as continuity of services and employment, really to keep services in place and really to keep our staff employed. And so as I transition to the next slide, so in addition to some of those general restrictions and requirements for all federal funds, there are a few things that are specific to ESSER 2 and ESSER 3. One is that all ESSER funds had some form of a state of maintenance effort. That means basically that the intention behind this is to ensure that federal funds are not used in place of state funds. So why is this important? Because it shows that the intention of the funds, they're supposed to be used in addition to annual funding, recognizing that COVID-19 has increased the needs, and these funds can assist with that response effort. Also, I want to just highlight that there's a requirement that we use at least 20% for activities to address learning loss. We can use more than 20%, but we cannot use less than 20% of our allotment for learning loss. And so I'm going to transition to the next slide. So when we talk about optimization of COVID funding, the Council of the Great City Schools, which I know that you all are familiar with, provided some guidance to school districts across the country for the optimization of the COVID funds. And that has been extremely helpful. Part of this planning process that we have underway right now. And one of the things that they shared is that getting our students back into school buildings for in-person instruction is priority. And this means taking care of some of the immediate needs in a variety of areas. They also said that we should use as a guide addressing unfinished learning as well as building equitable systems that last, that can be sustained. And then I just want to spend a moment on the alignment of the major investments on the next slide that are planned for the ESSER dollars. And so as we look at the alignment with the strategic plan on the next slide, I think it's helpful for the public to hear that we had a strategic plan in place before COVID struck our community and our world. And we're continuing to work toward the strategic plans despite COVID. However, there are some additional needs that we have as a school system that are the result of COVID. And so the strategies that you see here, these were not developed in isolation, but they do respond to the increased needs, but also align to our strategic plan. And so if you look in the middle, you'll see some of the CRESA investments. And I just want to say, I'm going to refer to CRESA, which is short for Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations. I know it's a mouthful, but I'll just say CRESA for short. And so the CRESA investments that you see in the middle column, those investments came out of the work of those focus area teams that I lifted up a little bit earlier. And they are aligned to our strategic plan to help us in, and they're there to help us increase what we're doing in response to COVID. And so I'm going to jump to the next slide, and as I promised you I would, I wanted to come back to our camp CMS experience, and it will truly be an experience. We're very excited about this opportunity. It will be an opportunity for our K-12 students who need additional support in reading, math, and science, including our students learning English and our students with disabilities. It's a 6-week summer experience, Monday through Thursday. It will take place from June the 14th to July the 29th with a 1-week break. And that will be during that 4th of July week, July 5th through the 9th. And we're implementing this experience in select schools all across our 6 learning communities. And Camp CMS will also offer some social and emotional as well as instructional support for our students who need continued learning due to the impact of the pandemic. It's going to be fun. Students will have an opportunity to learn with their friends, as well as experience opportunities with community partners, and there'll be so much more. I do want to lift up that we will provide transportation, meals will be free, and we'll have those daily enrichment and physical activities, as well as I mentioned, the social and emotional support. So we're extremely excited about Camp CMS, and that work is well underway. I do want to go to the next slide, please, and I want to just talk just for a moment about student wellness and academic support. And so there's an investment, $4.8 million. And why is that important? Why is that important? We collect data from our students. We know that panorama data indicates that our CMS students would benefit from support in specific areas of social emotional learning. And as our students transition back to in-person instruction, we know it is a critical time. It's a critical time, and for us to have the supports in place for those social emotional learning, as well as to decrease absenteeism, as well as suspensions. So I want to transition to technology. And why are we asking for the investment in technology? Because we know on the next slide that in September of 2021, we have over 44,000 student Chromebooks that will no longer be supported by Google. That's simply due to age, simply due to age. And we have to replace these Chromebooks because it's critical. It is absolutely critical to ensure that all of our students have access to our current technology for whether it be remote, hybrid, or in-person instruction. I want to transition now to academics. And I've talked about how the pandemic has increased academic needs and unfinished instruction for our students. It's critical that we provide the resources, professional development, and other supports that are necessary to meet the needs of students as well as our staff members. Moving on to the next slide, which is about health and safety, and you'll see $43.7 million investment. This is about the prevention and the reduction of the spread of COVID-19, which is critical to ensuring that our schools are safe for in-person learning, improving indoor air quality, using PPE, personal protective equipment, and minimizing those high-touch surfaces. We know that these measures, that they can prevent and reduce the spread of COVID-19, and that these, they ultimately impact our students being in school for in-person learning. And so I'm going to transition to the staffing page. We know that we need our current staff to continue all the services that we provide to our students. Even though enrollment went down during the pandemic, we believe it was important to provide staffing to schools at a similar level as pre-COVID, as we did pre-COVID. And so that was important to us. And we know that our school-based staff, we know that they have taken on some considerable additional responsibilities during the pandemic. So we're working to provide an additional responsibility stipend to certified staff to offset this and to be able to compensate them for this. On the next slide, you will see another pie chart. And this really is a summary of the CRISA funds because we know that, the COVID additional responsibility stipend, is included in this amount, as well as funds for nurse extenders are included in this graphic that you see before you. I'm going to transition and just talk briefly on the next slide about planning for the ESSER II funds, the American Recovery Plan Act funds. And so we're excited. We are extremely excited to be receiving this funding and to embark really on what is a thoughtful and inclusive planning process that results in a plan that is meaningful, that's measurable, and that is impactful. And we're going to plan for the use of these funds in a strategic way that includes stakeholder feedback and engagement and results in a program and budget that meet the immediate and the longer term needs of our students, our educators, and our CMS community. And so part of the overall budget and the focus area teamwork for alignment, and because we will need to consider carefully the ways that we can meet the increased needs and ensure lasting impact of these dollars, that's going to be critical as well. And so as we transition to the next slide, I just want to talk about, we're starting with stakeholder input, and that is helping to inform the planning that the focus area teams are doing. And we're thinking about planning first for immediate needs and then being able to build on that for long-term transformation. Really building a multi-year approach that is transformational. I know the pandemic has been approximately just over a 1-year experience, but we will need a multi-year, a multi-phase approach to address the impacts of the pandemic. And so we're going to be taking the time that we need to vet and align the plans from the focus area teams to ensure this cohesive strategy. And so as I transition on the next slide, we continue to talk about planning for the ESSER 3 dollars. And I want to be very clear that we have not received all of these funds as of yet. Those funds will continue to come in, and we expect to receive the ESSER 2 and ESSER 3 funds in late May or in June. So we have not received those funds, but we feel like it's important to begin that planning process with our stakeholders about how we will spend those dollars. And so as we transition to the next phase of the presentation, I want to just spend a few moments on the local funding request for 21-22. And that's our request of Mecklenburg County. On this slide, you'll see an investment in our dedicated, hardworking employees to the tune of just over $10 million. Great schools start with great teachers, and the pandemic has made recruitment and retention. It has made it a little bit more challenging, but we must be competitive and compensate our staff while managing and developing competencies. The research shows, as you all know, that the single most important factor that drives academic success for students is great teaching. And so we must fund our teachers and our staff. They've been asked to do more this year than they ever have before, including hybrid teaching with students present virtually and in person in many cases. I'm going to transition to our next slide. The next ask here is for funds for our facilities. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it is that safe working and learning environments are important now more than ever. And so our facilities are our biggest local request because our facilities are a significant funding of our funding needs and have such a long-term impact. Our students and staff need safe places to learn and work. Preventive maintenance is also necessary to help keep our facilities operating as they must. And so this was the case pre-pandemic, and it remains the case now, and it will be the case well after our community has overcome the pandemic. Continuing along this theme on the next slide around facilities, we are opening new schools to help relieve overcrowding and provide some much needed new classroom space. But in doing so, it adds to our operating costs with more square footage. And so in addition, we've got several new facilities opening and coming online in 21-22 school year, and that square footage is necessary to help relieve some overcrowding at some of the existing schools. But when we add facility space, we increase the overall cost to operate. And I just want to share it momentarily. We have one new elementary school, a 45 classroom school that will relieve Nations Ford Elementary School, Sterling, as well as Still Creek Elementary Schools. We also have a K-8 language immersion school in the north part of the county. And that facility is located on the site of the old J.M. Alexander Middle School. We also have a new K-8 language immersion facility that's located on the old Nations Ford Elementary school site. And then we have a replacement school, and that's Briarwood Elementary School, a 45 classroom facility, and that will replace the school that was built in 1956. And so moving on with our county funding request, we continue our effort to modernize our operation in the areas such as finance and human resources. And we know that the investments in these areas will lead us to more efficient operations and long-term savings due to those efficiencies. And as I transition to the next slide, student wellness and academic support. We ask Mecklenburg County to help us in the key area of student wellness and academic support. And you'll see 2 question marks in the charts. And that's because while we do know that the pandemic has had a tremendous impact in areas such as increased suicide risk and additional referrals to community support services, it is difficult to assess those areas during a year when assessments have not happened as they would in normal times. But with families facing insecurities such as food, housing, and jobs, we know that students are suffering social and emotional hardship. So we have to pay attention to the health of our students. And to that end, we need a great investment in this particular area. And so transitioning to our next slide here, our team has been working on disproportionality. And specifically this year, we've been able to really go deep with looking at some root causes of high numbers, in our schools and out of suspension, high numbers of in-school and out-of-school suspensions. We know that they must be present. We know students must be present to learn. And we also know that there are many behaviors that do not warrant out-of-school suspension, but do require support and redirections. And so the behavior and support centers, this is a proactive strategy focused on coaching appropriate behavior. This is a 10-school pilot program that is designed to create a new in-school suspension model that can be leveraged across the school district. And this model focuses on providing psychologically safe places for our students to be coached on behavior response while also remaining engaged in classroom work. And so the goal is really to reduce recidivism, and we want 2 things. We want to get to the root of the behavior and give students the tools that they need to respond appropriately. And then secondly, we want to analyze adult behavior to ensure if there are adult behaviors that need to be addressed. And so overall, what we want to see is a decline in the number of referrals and suspensions in the district. And as I mentioned, there are 10 schools that we are looking to pilot this effort in. As it relates to our funding request, on the next slide to charter school student growth, we expect a growth in the pass-through funding for charter schools as this trend continues across the state, but also across the country. And here on the next slide, we just show our proposed county appropriation request along with the request from the previous school year. On the next slide, we'd just like to spend a moment to provide some details of our capital funding request. These funds will be used for things such as equipment replacement, track and athletic facility refurbishments, lighting upgrades, playground replacements, and many other things. And here you see on the next slide, you'll see the $18 million in our sustainment request and how those funds would be used. I would like to just highlight that these funds increase the life cycle of the building and system components, which also delays major capital outlays at various schools. We're grateful to Mecklenburg County and the citizens of our county for making investments in our schools, and these funds are needed to help protect those investments. As we transition to the next slide, this request also includes preventive maintenance and the installation of 2 bus garages to help protect our transportation fleet long term. Now, in the next slide, you'll see a summary of this year's budget. The column on the left details the proposed budget without including COVID-related temporary funding, and on the right, we include all funding sources. And I know I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I want us to keep in mind that, as I've stated earlier, we don't yet have these funds from the most recent legislation, the ARP. And we've not proposed allocation for that funding at this time. But in the spirit of transparency, we thought it was important to go ahead and include the estimated amounts that we expect to receive when all of the COVID-related funding has been provided to the school district. And as I mentioned before, we're going to engage members of our community. We've already started that process to help us make smart decisions on how to use those funds. So with that, Chairman Dunlap, Vice Chair Powell, and members of the Board of County Commissioners, Chair, County Manager Diorio, I am going to conclude my part of the presentation, and at this time I want to recognize Dr. Frank Barnes, as I mentioned, who is our Chief Accountability and Equity Officer. But before I do that, I want to just share a very broad overview of the current situation. We are not where we were 2 years ago. Students have suffered during this pandemic, and we must make up ground to get back to where we were and to get on track toward the goals that we set out in our strategic plan. But we must also acknowledge that education does not take place in a vacuum. And the realities that our students have faced for more than 1 year extend beyond the physical and the virtual classrooms. These realities have particularly been impactful on our Black and our brown students, the same students whose educational outcomes were, some would say, inequitable pre-COVID. So we arrive at today's conversation understanding the challenges that we must overcome in the present and more significant, that are more significant than they were pre-COVID. And so with that context, I'm going to turn to Dr. Frank Barnes to share his insights on our strategic plan 2024 goals and targets. With that, Dr. Barnes, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Superintendent. I will be swift, but I'll try to be detailed and leave the lion's share of the time that we have remaining for your questions, comments, and discussion with Chairwoman Dashew. Next slide, please. As we've stated previously, the dollars that the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education seeks from you and seeks to utilize from the federal government are in service of three large overarching board goals. Primarily, but yet not exclusively, to make sure that the students who graduate from the Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools are ready and prepared for meaningful employment and higher educational opportunities. In pursuit of that, next slide. Thank you. We have a set of targets, but I would like to direct your attention to those middle set of chevrons in black. Those are a set of indicators that are in our strategic plan that were present prior to the pandemic. Those are the things that we're pursuing. Those are the things that we'd like to be held accountable for, the things we'd like to measure, monitor, and report to you with regularity by subgroup. Overall, what we articulated in the chevrons to your right in the blue are where we want to be, or where we wanted to be pre-pandemic in 6 years. We wanted 95% of our high school students to graduate in 4 years, 75% to graduate earning at least one state graduation endorsement, 75% of our high school graduates to have had at least one college level course, that 6% of our 8th graders en route to high school would have completed Math 1 by the end of 8th grade successfully. And when we talk about our end of grade and end of course assessments, those are assessments required by our state, we wanted to cut the percent not college and career ready, a higher bar than our state uses, which is grade level proficiency, but we wanted to cut the percent not college and career ready in half for each racial subgroup. And by doing so, reduce the gap between our black and white students by over 50%. Allow me to eliminate, as we talk about these things that we want to be measured by in the black chevrons in the middle, through where we were pre-pandemic and what our annual milestones were in some of those illustrative areas. Next slide, please. What you see here below are where the milestones were for our 6-year strategic plan pre-pandemic. Going from left to right on the bottom in the chart, you can see the percent college and career ready for 4 major racial subgroups and our students in the aggregate. What you see on the top is a line graph illustrating what the progress would be for each group. What our aim was to see that we would raise the floor and tear off the roof, that we would raise the performance of all subgroups of recognizing those with the most students not yet college and career ready would have to increase at greater and greater rates. We strategically allowed ourselves time to adopt and implement with fidelity new curriculum in English language arts and mathematics. In the early years of our strategic plan, starting in the early grades intentionally in kindergarten, 1st and 2nd grade, and even 3rd grade, and then in 6th grade in the middle grades, so that as those students in the younger grades progress through the continuum, we begin to see the fruits of that effort of our teachers and our principals and those who support both. So in this particular instance, this is an anomaly of all of our measures, that at the time our superintendent encouraged us, in fact required us to say that our community had set a big, hairy, audacious goal to achieve 80% of our 3rd graders to be reading on college career ready by the year 2024. That is led by our partner Reach Charlotte and members of the philanthropic community. So we aligned our targets to this, recognizing that they, yes, were big, hairy, and audacious, but we're pursuing them. So where were we pre-pandemic? Next slide, please. Thank you. What you see is going from left to right. You see where we were before we began that year 1, so the 2018 actual, and then you see the 2019 percent college and career ready in English language arts in grade 3 actual, and then you see the year 1 target. So you can see how did our actual performance for the students overall in the aggregate and for those subgroups compare to what our goals were. You see blanks in the year 2020. As Mr. Winston mentioned, what we have here is that we did not test students across the state of North Carolina, actually across the country, in these grades in 2020 due to the pandemic. So we don't have data for that. But you see where our year 2 target was. We're now approaching 2021, which would be our year 3 target, and we're waiting to see where we are. And I'll talk a bit about where we project to be in a moment. But you can see where we were going for our annual milestones and how we were progressing. In some instances, we were already behind. In others, we were right there on the cusp of hitting our targets pre-pandemic. Next slide, please. As you look at another example, this is grade 5 mathematics. end of grade assessments, percent college and career ready. And you can see, once again, just like you saw in grade 3 English language arts, going from left to right, both in the aggregate and by subgroups, you can see where we were looking to start and how we wanted to see the progression. But as those who had greater percentage of students not yet proficient, as we cut that gap in half, other gaps between racial subgroups would be able to close. Next slide, please. As with the previous chart, going from left to right, you saw where we were in 2018, and then you see where we were in 2019. We wanted to be sure to include this particular slide in mathematics because across the state of North Carolina, we'd renormed our assessments and changed the scales of how college and career ready calculations were determined across the state. The result of that change, noted by the asterisk at the top of that column, 2019 actual, and the footnote at the bottom indicate that resulted in scores going down across the state, and that was experienced here in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools. So you can see even pre-pandemic, with that change in the assessment, we were already lagging behind our 2019 targets, and we're behind as we were going into the pandemic. We wanted to make you aware of this and address them. Certainly we can talk about this more as we have questions. Next slide, please. Another category of things we said we would like to be held accountable for is state graduation endorsements. The North Carolina Department of Public Instruction and North Carolina State Board of Education awards graduates one of 5 types of endorsements based on either their course taking and their unweighted grade point average. Based on that, we want to see our students, at least 75% of our students, at the conclusion of our plan, be able to earn at least one endorsement. Certainly, many of our graduates earn multiple endorsements. You can kind of see, going from left to right, what our annual milestones were for select racial subgroups and our students in the aggregate. Next slide, please. Thank you. Where you can see is where we were in our 2019, next to our 2019 target. And you can see in some instances, we were already starting to surpass that. We saw a slight decrease as you go from left to right where we were in 2020, and we're just shy of hitting our targets in the aggregate, although we were seeing some progress for some other subgroups. But we have some work here to do, so you can see here where we were projecting over time and where we were as we were entering the pandemic. Next slide, please. Another set of areas that we want to make sure that we're investing is the students getting access to these college-level courses, expanding opportunities for more rigorous coursework. What you see here is where we were looking at milestones going from left to right from 2019, that would be year 1, to 2024. And something I think that is noteworthy that I did not mention as I began in my haste is that 2019 was the beginning of our strategic plan. So when we were interrupted by the pandemic, we were not yet 2 years into our strategic plan. That does not diminish where we were or where we were not as we entered the pandemic, but I think it merits us being able to indicate where we were in our progress. Next slide, please. Going from left to right, what you see here is where we were in the percent of students completing at least one college-level course for both all students in the aggregate, which is the top row, and then for select racial subgroups going from left to right. You can see where we were next to target and see we were making progress in this particular area, right there surpassing some of our 2020 milestones, in some cases just short of that, depending on the subgroup. We're making progress. We'll be looking and see how we're doing, continuing towards those pre-pandemic milestones. Next slide, please. So as we're saying, here's where we were entering the pandemic. We want to give you a quick snapshot of where we are in the pandemic and how we're projecting our performance will look based on our fall end of course performance. End of course assessments are taken by our high school students in 4 different classes: Math 1, Math 3, English 2, and Biology. We have fall to fall results and also compare ourselves to the state to give you a picture of what's happening. Next slide, please. So the big snapshot is that in CMS we're seeing, and across the state I might add, we're seeing lower participation rates and lower overall performance. And I say performance, I mean lower percentage of students in college and career ready. And look, we see our declines. We're seeing a decline so far of approximately 18 percentage points in Math 1, which is our highest decline. And we're seeing a slight decline in English 2 of our lowest level of decline, which is approximately 3 percentage points. And this is compared to where we were from the pre-pandemic. That would have been in December of 1920 school year when we were finishing our testing. December or January, I should say. Next slide, please. In these next successive slides, you'll see two different color schemes to indicate where is CMS data and where is state data. The purple slides indicate where we're seeing the state. The blue slides are displaying where we see CMS. First, when we look at test taking across the state, what is customarily required by federal law, which is only waived this year, is that 95% of students must be tested. That is the federal requirement of the Every Student Succeeds Act. However, you can see as a state that only about 86% of students tested across all of our subgroups as a state. So we already are seeing that some students are not being counted in the testing regimen. Next slide, please. Thank you. Where we see in CMS, what you see is we're a little bit higher than the state at 88%, but we weren't able to hit that 95% threshold. Once again, that's the significance of that is to recognize some students aren't being counted in these test results. And so as we look at this, this is what we're saying where we are, but that's something that we and the state are struggling with. So although the federal government has provided a waiver to states upon request, and the State Board of Education has requested and received a waiver from 95% tested, it marks to say that some students are absent from our testing regimen. So what do our results look like so far, to give you a picture of where we are in the pandemic? Next slide, please. Once again, this is purple. So these are our statewide results, and you see the four results, the four different courses: biology, English 2, math 1, and math 3. What you see is the percent, and this is how the state's going to begin reporting out these results. They're going to talk about percent of students not proficient, and they're going to talk about percent level 3, which they would say are grade level proficient, but we're looking at the percent level 4 and 5, which the state calls college and career ready. What you already see, if I were to direct your eyes to the far left, the percent not proficient on this particular slide, and I'm going to then pick up my pace a bit, is what you can see is regardless in biology, math 1 and math 3, we're seeing increases in the percent who are not proficient as a state. Across the state in English 2, we saw a slight decline, and that's, once again, an anomaly amongst the four tested areas when you compare last year to this year. But that's what we're seeing as a statewide trend. So we wanted to make sure that, wanted to be able to bring that to your attention. So what does it look like for CMS? Next slide, please. So what you can see that the trends we see in the state are the same trends we're seeing here. So as we're in the pandemic, what we're already projecting is that the percent of our students who are not proficient, just like in the state, is increasing, and the percent of students who are level 4 and level 5 are decreasing. This is in the aggregate. So what we're projecting is as we're even looking at how we're doing as we're in the pandemic, is that we're seeing the impact of the pandemic on our students and their learning. Next slide, please. And I'm not going to belabor this, but wanted to provide both for you and for any members of the listening public to be able to look exam by exam, to be able to see across various subgroups how we're doing. Once again, this is the purple, so you can see as a state where we are. Where as a state, for example, when we're looking at biology, we increased for Black students, approximately 62% of students were not proficient in biology for the state of North Carolina pre-pandemic. Now, in the pandemic, as this year, approximately 3 in 4 Black students in the state of North Carolina are not proficient. So you can see subgroup by subgroup where we are as a state. Next slide, please. So as we look at what CMS's results look like, things are a little bit better than we see statewide. However, you're seeing the increase in the percent not proficient. If I were to direct your eyes to the far left, the percent not proficient, we're seeing increases in the percent not proficient. And if I were to then direct your eyes to the far right, you can see we're seeing some decreases in the percent who are level 4 or level 5. This is for biology. But with the exception of English 2, you're seeing the same trend in math 1 and math 3. Next slide, please. And so here you can see what performance looks like in English 2 across the state. Next slide, please. And you can see what it looks like here in CMS, with the state total being at the very top row, and then the CMS total in comparison being the row right beneath that. You have an opportunity to look at 1920 versus 2021, so pre-pandemic, pandemic, and you can look at each of the subgroups. So what we're seeing is, although English 2 had the smallest impact, we're seeing some small shifts there. Next slide, please. In the interest of time and leaving the line share for your discussion, you can see in Math 1, we're seeing as a state relatively large increases in the percent who are not proficient overall in Math 1. Just to illustrate, when you look at approximately right in the top half for Black and Hispanic students, for Black students, we went from approximately 67% of our students as a state not proficient to nearly 83% not proficient for our state. For Hispanic students, we went from 55% not proficient pre-pandemic to approximately 75% in the pandemic. This is the statewide, the impact of the pandemic statewide. Next slide, please. Here we're seeing in CMS, we're seeing comparable shifts in the percent of students not proficient, though the numbers are not identical, the direction and the trajectory of the impact is similar. And we're seeing an increase in the percent of students not proficient, and we're seeing a reduction in percent of students level 4 and level 5. This is in the mid-year point. And so we'll be curious as we go ready for testing in the next few weeks to see what we're looking like at the conclusion of our entire school district. So next slide, please. And so when we look at, could you click it 4 times, please? Thank you. So another assessment, so that was what we're looking at in our high school. As we think about how are we looking in our elementary and middle grades, specifically K through 8, we use another assessment that's administered 3 times a year called the Measure of Academic Progress. Some of you may know it by its acronym, MAP. We use these results to be able to look and say which students need extra help or extra challenge, and to be able to direct supports in that kind of way. What we saw for our kindergarten students when we administered this assessment in the fall and in the winter, we saw our kindergarten and first grade students, many were in the 80th and 90 percentiles. What we assume is what we've seen across the country is that well-meaning adults and family members were likely helping their younger children on the assessments. And so what we're looking at in kindergarten and first grade, we don't feel is valid and representative of what our students know and can do. We would hope that all of our kindergarten and first graders are in the 90th percentile and higher, but we recognize that trends are across the country that perhaps an adult was helping to meet, with best intentions, support their children on these assessments. However, when we look at grades 3 through 8, we think they can be more valid measures of where we're going directionally. So although these assessments are used to tell us which students might need extra help or extra challenge and in what areas, they also have a predictive element to tell us how might students perform on an end of grade assessment in grades 3 through 8 in either English language arts and mathematics. When we look at our overall performance on this measure of academic progress, which again we administer 3 times a year, after the winter administration, we were seeing, just like we saw with our end of course performance, that we were looking to be declining in our percent of students projected to be college and career ready as an overall student body and for subgroups. Next slide, please. So as we come to you in the future, as we come to our community, we want to make sure that we're being more transparent and being purposeful in being transparent, which has been the charge of our board led by Ms. Dashu, as well as what you've asked for as representatives of our community. So there's 3 commitments we'd like to make to you and to our community around transparency for our strategic plan and our annual milestones. Next slide, please. The first is to make sure that we're updating with regularity an already existing performance dashboard that's available through our district website. That dashboard has every measure I told you right now, by grade, by school, by race, and you can disaggregate by gender. We did not update it for the 1920 school year. We'll be updating it after this school year and make sure there's any data that, because the data was incomplete, that the data is replenished for 2020, even though if it might be, excuse the technical term, a little wonky, as some data might not be there, might be incomplete. So that's the first thing, that it will be available to you. Our second commitment is as a complement to this existing performance dashboard that we're going to create and have on our public-facing website a scoreboard. Next slide, please. Thank you. So a scoreboard that by these big, large measures will allow you to keep track for our progress the prior year against that projected milestone and be able to look forward across milestones, and that would be in the aggregate and for every major subgroup, so that you and your constituents and our board can continue to monitor and look at that. And our third commitment is to let you know how we're doing during the game. Next slide, please. As we're progressing towards those things in those middle chevrons, the things we want to be measured by, what we do as a staff, what we'll be bringing to the Charlotte-Mecklenburg board, is to say, how are we doing against a set of indicators called leading indicators that both research and field knowledge says has a predictive element, although not perfect, can give us a projection of how we might do on these things in the middle in the black. We commit to you to come to you after our first quarter, after our second quarter, and after our third quarter, either in a written report or, as Superintendent Winston and Ms. Dashu asked, come to you and present to you physically. Those details can be worked out between the bodies, but we commit to you to give you a quarterly summary after the first, second, and third quarter results. So we want to be able to increase and intentionally commit to transparency to you and your constituents. Next slide, please. But as we've shown these results of where we are in the pandemic, we need to recognize that right now we're educating in a different type of reality. And that reality has had a disproportionate impact on particularly those who are in concentrations of poverty. And we need to recognize that. What we're going to do as we look at our results is we're going to say, okay, how do we need to recalibrate our milestones? How far are we from these milestones? We already see that in the pandemic, statewide, and we're going to project nationally, although we don't have national numbers yet, that our figures are going to be down. That's the impact of the pandemic. So we need to be able to go back, led by the superintendent, reporting to our board chair and the board. Here's what we want to see milestones, and come back to you with how we want to be able to be publicly transparent and accountable for how we're doing. But that's work that we have to do based on how we're doing this year, and use this year as a way to kind of reset so that we can still set big, hairy, and audacious goals with the plan that we put forward. Next slide, please. And so some key dates to keep in mind as we're looking at our results. We'll be doing our end-of-year testing from May 12th to the 28th. That's right in front of us. We'll be finalizing our calculations of our four-year cohort graduation rate to the state in mid-July. And in August, this year, English language arts assessments are being recalibrated the way they were for mathematics in 2019. So we'll be resetting some things, and we won't get results in English language arts until mid-August. So we'll look at those results as the state does, but we will also get some preliminary end-of-grade and end-of-course results in math, science, and those other areas. The State Board of Education will release preliminary end-of-year results in the beginning of September at their beginning of month board meeting. There'll be a correction window, which every district partakes in to make sure that the results are accurate based on a preliminary review. And then the State Board of Education will release those official results in October. Once we have those scrubbed official results in October, that will confirm work that we'll be doing as soon as we start getting results, to be able to say, here's where our new baseline is, and be able to set some milestones that we can come and share with you. With that, I want to hand things over to Ms. Dashu.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Barnes. So what you've heard, and I'll call you colleagues because I consider you colleagues, what you have heard right now from Superintendent Winston and from Dr. Barnes is a huge amount of context and a huge amount of details to help you make sense of our local funding request. So we just wanted to be clear, this is an extraordinary year with unbelievable needs, unprecedented needs that our children and their families are experiencing, recovering from the pandemic. And we also have a historic infusion of federal funding coming to us that we wanted you to understand clearly what's coming, what we can use it for, what we're going to use it for, and with the last bucket of funding, that there's actually going to be community engagement as we thoughtfully determine how best to use those funds. And yet, regardless, we have our local funding request, which reflects what our children needed before the pandemic and continue to need, pandemic or not. I think of this as, I think of a metaphor sort of like I am the head of my household. I am responsible for bringing in revenue to take care of the expenses that what my kids need. I have to feed them, I have to give them clothes, I have to pay for the mortgage, I have to pay for the electric and the gas bill. And then imagine a tornado comes through and tears the roof off our house. And hopefully I've got insurance, and insurance will cover the expenses for repairing the damage. But the insurance money doesn't cover the expenses that were there already for the food and the electric and the mortgage. I still have to find the funds to pay for that. And that's the context to give you for how we're using the federal funding to rise to the occasion of this incredible historic challenge that our children are facing, while at the same time coming to you with our regular request, not that different than what we asked for last year or the year before. And at the same time, we've shared with you great detail on our strategic thinking and the data, a wealth of data that is just beginning to come in as we emerge from the pandemic. So this is possibly the highest stakes budget request that we have ever brought to you. And this budget request was built strategically and with great care, given all the different buckets of funding and all of the needs, to give our students exactly what they need to get back on track after COVID. And as the superintendent shared, I think we had a series of 5 board meetings that went into really thinking through this budget. We've had, I believe it was 3 community meetings. We've met with our student advisors. We've met with our teacher advisors to get all those perspectives to make this the most effective request, the most effective budget possible. It's a modest increase over what we asked of you last year, and the increase is really only because of increasing costs that we don't control, like those ever-increasing costs of what we've got to pass through to charters, ever-increasing costs for healthcare benefits and retirement, and estimating what the state is going to do in a raise for our teachers so that we can ask you to match that. And just a few new initiatives that are essential and that we cannot use federal COVID relief funds for. And we really pushed back on staff and asked them to kind of scrub what is it that we can pay for with federal funds, and let's pay for that with federal funds. So what we're asking you for is what we need the local support for. The students that we're privileged to serve, as you know, faced great needs for the pandemic, and those needs still exist. And they deserve for us to meet their needs. And our job as a school board is to ask for what they need. So the budget was built by the subject experts who are closest to the work. And we are very simply coming to you today to ask you to fund our schools, to provide our students with what they very simply need. And so thank you for your attention today. I know you've got a wealth of materials to go through after this, but we're happy to answer any questions that you might have right now.
Thank you, CMS staff and board for your presentation. Having looked at this as you presented, I guess I was behind you all the time. It is a wealth of information. And given what I've seen, what I've read, I think you probably disclosed a lot. Some of it not so pretty, but at least you've disclosed it to give us an opportunity to decide what we want to do in terms of our funding request. Given that we don't have a time certain on this meeting and our next meeting starts at 5 o'clock, I want everybody to take time to ask your questions, but also be prepared to write questions down that we will submit for further in the event that you don't have the opportunity to ask your questions. I'm also going to allow for a little more time than we typically give, but the purpose is to ask questions and not make so many statements. So, Madam Clerk, if you will set the timer, first time around 3 minutes and a 2-minute follow-up. So that gives everybody at least 5 minutes. Hopefully somebody else will ask your question and you won't need to ask all of you. We'll start to my right. We'll start with you, Commissioner Jarrell, and be prepared to write down any questions that you don't get to answer, asked today, and we'll submit them to, where should we submit the question? To Adrian or you, Dina? To Adrian for follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So thank you so much for being here and for the presentation and the information. I think the chairman definitely outlined the transparency, which definitely jumped out at me as well. A couple areas that I'd like to touch on, equity and accountability. If we could put up slide 63, if that's possible. While we're waiting for that slide to come up, if you all turn to it, I have a question around when we're looking at, and this is more like from a practical standpoint, when we look at the percentage of our students that are reflected in that not proficient.
What page?
I'm sorry, slide 63.
63, right.
When we look at that number, particularly, and if you'll focus on the African-American column for me, can you help the community understand what does that mean in practical terms? If you have 78%, or the pandemic notwithstanding, but 53% of our children that are not proficient, what prospects do that group of children have? What does that mean? What does that say to you all as the professionals and subject matter experts?
Thank you, Commissioner Jarrell. What that says to me is, and I'm going to say the pre-pandemic and then in the pandemic.
I'm sorry, if you could speak up just a little bit louder.
I'm sorry, I'm sorry, sir. So starting with the kind of looking at the pre-pandemic, the 1920, and then the 2021. I think what that says is, and this is for high school, this is not 8th grade students.
Understood.
So what this says to us is that we have a good bit of work to do. Students who are in high school, 9th grade, on what some of us might have called algebra, it's not exactly a matched, but we'll say in Math 1, they're not on track to be able to be competitive for different STEM careers. They're not on track to be able to be eligible to be able to be competitive in a global marketplace. This is why one of the areas that there's 2 things that we wanted to make sure we did as part of our plan. One is we wanted to say we need to be able to get students better prepared. This isn't a reflection on high schools. This isn't a reflection on high schools. This is a reflection on our preparedness as they're entering high school. And I say ours, not theirs. So us, our ability to prepare them to be successful there.
So I apologize for interrupting you,
No,
Dr.
sir.
Barnes. It's just we're on a timer. So let me ask you this. Who is accountable for what we see there? When we see these numbers, particularly with Black and brown children, who is accountable? How are we holding them accountable as a community?
And I'll answer that. We're accountable. I mean, ultimately, my board and I are accountable for this, and the voters hold us accountable, and we hold ourselves accountable. We did a very intensive retreat on Friday and Saturday with a governance coach from the Council of Great City Schools with this mantra of student outcomes don't change until adult behaviors change. And we are committed to holding ourselves to ever higher expectations so that the children that we serve can meet the high expectations that they're capable of meeting. And yes, it's a lot of work to dismantle hundreds of years of institutional and systemic racism, which affects our society and it affects our schools. And I know you all know of that because you're tackling that work through public health and through housing and through jobs. We're tackling it through the schools, and we will not shy away from that work. But we hold ourselves accountable, and this board holds our staff accountable with high expectations. And I think the pandemic has raised the stakes and helped us sharpen our focus. And so you can watch us in the coming months as we continue this work with our governance of really sharpening our focus to that intense look at student outcomes and what adult behaviors need to change to get our kids to those outcomes.
All right. Elaine? Okay. I typically wouldn't go up, I'd go last, but since we're going in this order, let me ask a number of questions. First thing I noticed was that all performance measures were taken out of your goals. So I'd like for you to speak to that. Additionally, when you talked about the kind of money that you were spending, when I add up the totals, while you don't have it all yet, that's $500.3 million, but you only talked about the expense of a little more than $100 million. We'll talk more about the finances later. But I want to go back to some of the stuff that Mark Jarrell was asking, because I had similar questions and I wanted to make sure I clearly understood it. So not proficient to me says that those people are the ones on level 1. Is that pretty accurate?
What the state would have previously called level 1 or level 2, sir.
Okay, so what if we go back to just the page that he was referring to, then I think that was page 63, was it? Page 63. So to his question, so that I'm clear, 78% of African-American children were in level 1.
This last testing regimen in the pandemic, that is correct.
I hear you.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I said, yes, that would be correct. In the pandemic, this last testing regimen.
Okay. And then likewise, I want to go back to a couple of pages that I marked up. And I recognize that you say that was a result of the pandemic, but I want to go back to, let's start with page 51. I'm going to go backwards. Let's look at all students. We'll look at page 51. So in your 6-year strategic plan, you have projected that 50% of the students would be graduate with one college course, but the actual was 52. So in 2019, you're at 2.5% above. In 2020, your actual was 54.4, and you have projected it would be 55. So we're looking at about a 2% increase in that span. But it didn't appear that you changed your projections for 21 throughout. So if you're only gaining about 2.5% each year, what strategies are procedures are you putting in place to get to 60% in 2021?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
So part of what, can I still answer?
yeah, that's just for us.
Okay. Part of what we did is it's a multi-step process. The first thing is being able to identify students earlier from a diversity of backgrounds who we would say are ready and prepared to be successful in those courses, and we broaden our definition. In the past, we would have relied on just a quantitative measure, the PSAT, which is administered by the College Board, which we give to our 10th and 11th graders. We broadened and went beyond that to include a survey of all of our students in 9 through 12, asking about their career interests, the different things around their persistence, and a trusted adult in the building. So the first thing, we wanted to identify more students who we could push in. The second thing, we then use that data that they gave us, students use, to identify a trusted adult, to use those trusted adults to identify students who you could push into these courses. One thing we had to do is we had to increase the supply of advanced courses. It was too disparate from one school to the next. So what we did is we created a higher floor. We established that in every comprehensive high school, there had to be a minimum of 10 AP courses, and they were core AP courses across all of our courses. So we wanted to increase supply, expand those who were identified. Third, we then began to recognize we weren't monitoring that if you had potential or readiness based on your career interests, your persistence, that we weren't measuring to say, are you actually getting the course you showed persistence in? So we began to do monitoring to say, okay, how can we make sure that those students are actually getting into the courses? And then lastly, going back to review the following fall to say, are you actually landing in the course that you're asking for? You have a push-in, pull-in kind of approach. And so those are some things that after we looked at our first year, we said we need to be more specific. We've called it Success 2024. We recognize that also some students weren't necessarily ready for some of those advanced courses, but they could be successful in honors and then move up to that during their high school experience. So begin to also just say, it's not say advanced placement, international baccalaureate, dual enrollment, or nothing, to create a stair step to get more students in honors courses toward that as well. But we also saw that flatness, so there was things that we had to start doing to begin to say, how can we increase these numbers? Those are things that we did not have in place as we started our strategic plan, but we're putting in place in earnest as we went into the pandemic in 2019-20.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, all the representatives from CMS, for being here today. I have to tell you, I feel a profound pit in my stomach. I really feel quite ill seeing these statistics. I believe that the headline for the public and for the media should be what a profound crisis in education this community is experiencing. 68% of African American students not proficient in math. 78% of African American students not proficient, 68% not proficient in biology, 78% not proficient in math, versus 30% of white students. Nobody argues that the pandemic has exacerbated and made this job incredibly difficult, which is why in the time remaining, I want to turn our attention back to where we were before the pandemic, the accountability that we were seeking before the pandemic, because I'm still not sure where we were before we had this unbelievable burden placed upon us. So namely, at the time of the Breaking the Link report in 2016, there was a 40% gap between black and white students and a 43% gap between Hispanic and white students. And the goal was to cut those over 6 years, to cut those gaps in half by 2024. So my first question to you is, what exactly are the new metrics for measurement as we stare down the tunnel of 2024? And my second question to you is, historically, in 2018 to 2019, there were 60% plus of black and Hispanic students who were levels 1 and 2 in their EOGs, and they were to have received remediation plans known as MTSS plans by law. Yet, at the time before the pandemic, only about 3.2% of students were actually getting that remediation plan they were entitled to under the law. So what is the state of compliance with that for students who are entitled to it now? And what's the plan going forward to ensure that all the students who are entitled to that plan get it?
Thank you.
And if one of you gentlemen want to take the question about the metrics and the MTSS update, and then I'll take the question about the accountability.
Sure, thank you. Thank you. So to begin with the measure moving forward, is we want to continue to use the state's end-of-course assessment, which is the data that we provided here. So particularly for the biology area that you mentioned. But whether it be for end-of-grade assessments or end-of-course assessments, that remains to be part of our strategic plan and something we want to continue to report on and monitor and focus on.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Are you changing the benchmarks? Are you updating the benchmarks for 2024 expectations because of all that's happened?
I misunderstood your question, I'm sorry. That's something we need to review and see where we are at the conclusion of the year. Our intention is to reset our milestones based on where we are, but not to change the measure.
When will we have that?
So if I can take you back to, I believe it's slide maybe 69, 70. What we'll be coming back to you is we're looking in October after we get our official end-of-year results. There is a correction window after the preliminary results are released where we make sure that those results are accurate, that were in the preliminary presentation by the state board. The state board then makes those results official, and we'll use those official results to be able to do some recalibrating.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Leak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me say welcome to those of you who are here from the school board. I'm sitting here aching. I'm sitting here crying because I'm hearing information I've heard before, and there's no support for black children in this district. And if we didn't have black children in the district, you wouldn't have a school district. What is your population of black males that have failed in reading in Charlotte-Mecklenburg school system? 70% of our kids, black boys, cannot read. 42 of our schools are failing. Why? Who's responsible? 42 schools, and many of them are in my district, District 2, and my people are mad and upset. And I bring the message. What are you going to do? If you didn't have them in the school system, you wouldn't have a job. You wouldn't be there. So help me know what you're going to do to change this. I'm waiting.
Commissioner Leak, thank you for sharing what I think is the sentiment, what I know is the sentiment that is felt by me as superintendent, but also our entire staff. And I think Dr. Barnes will tell you that this is, when I talk to staff about where we are, and let me say, I do not put this on the backs of our students. I believe our students give us their best. And I think Chairwoman Dashew said, student outcomes will not change until adult behaviors change. And at the end of the day, the board holds me responsible for getting the results that we set out in our strategic plan. And I feel that same turmoil in my stomach, knowing that we have not gotten to a point where we're providing equity of opportunity for all students. Because I truly believe it's a reflection of the opportunity gap. I think when we talk about achievement gap, it implies that, well, students are doing something wrong. And I don't believe that is the case. And so the plan that we have in place, we talk about great teaching. That is our, I believe, our single most important lever to change outcomes for kids.
But you're not recruiting black teachers.
We have a significant amount of work to do to continue to make sure that our teaching population reflects the demographics of our student populations. And so we're up to the task, and we realize that that is an area of opportunity, and it's not something that we're going to shy away from. Certainly, it has been made more challenging in a pandemic and in a national teacher shortage, but I don't say that to give excuses. That is something that we absolutely, and we will do better on.
My last question,
Okay, Commissioner Lee, you'll have to wait till the next time. Commissioner Meyer.
and thank you for your response, sir.
Thank you, Chair.
Didn't answer the question.
I just have just a couple of things. One, you said earlier that you would be willing to come back here, I think, at the quarter, and go over at that point, the strides you've made at that point. If at that point you have not made strides, what do we do then?
I'll take that. I mean, and so we do, the superintendent and his team will be bringing reports to the board, and we will be sharing that progress with the public and are happy to share it with your board as well, however we all determine to do that. But I also want to be clear that you're not an oversight board. I mean, we hold our staff accountable, and the voters hold us accountable, the same voters who voted for you all and hold you all accountable. So while I appreciate all the tough questions, and I appreciate your partnership, especially on the funding portion of this, ultimately, our job in relationship with you is to be very clear and thoughtful about the funds that our students need in order to address these gaps. And then your responsibility is to choose how best to allocate the funds that you're responsible for.
Thank you. And my next question is this, have you made your request to the state? Do you make a request to the state, or does the state allocate what they want to allocate? And how far behind are they that you feel that they're behind in what they should be allocating to CMS?
The state goes through a process where the governor has proposed his budget, the House and the Senate will propose their budgets, then they'll come to resolution between the House and the Senate, and then they'll work it out with the governor. And at that point, we expect to have a budget. So we do have a legislative agenda. We've had some budget-related requests in there, but it's not the same thing where we go to them with a request. We do our very best to make an educated guess to anticipate what they're going to come through with and when, but it's not an exact science.
Thank you, and I do appreciate you all being here, and I know we all have one thing in common, and that is what is good for our students. And I do believe that you are trying and to do the best that you can for our students. This has been a terrible year, and we have a long way to go, and I know you're in a tough position, so thank you.
Commissioner McDowell.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I want to focus on the budget. And can you help me understand, when you guys have an ask of the county for things like student wellness and academic support, how is it that, how will you figure out the COVID funds that will address those, and then asking for additional county funds for the same? How does that work? Can you explain a little bit about that? And I'll just ask my second question in case all of this runs out of time. The second question is, how does the reduction of the number of students affect the budget and your ask? So I know that I've read 7,000 less students. How is that going to play into this?
So I'll take, so you all should take the student population question, the projected population. And as far as the COVID relief funds, one thing that we have to be very mindful of is that these, the COVID relief funds that have the longest time window expire in 2023. So if we hire a lot of employees with those funds, they would have to be, there's a chance, very strong chance that they would be furloughed or they would be laid off. We'd have a giant RIF in 2023. We actually went through that. I'll bet Chairman Dunlap and Commissioner Leek remember in the last recession, or you may have already been on the commission by then, but there were some massive, very painful RIFs when federal funding, we hit a fiscal cliff and lots of people had to lose their jobs. And so we don't want to repeat that scenario, nor do districts around the country. So we're being very careful about that. So when we ask you for funds, it's sort of this year-over-year jobs that we hope will continue in perpetuity versus sort of an emergency temporary infusion.
So does that mean, I'm sorry to interrupt, but does that mean, I just want to clarify, does that mean that you'll be asking, you'll be using certain COVID funds for student wellness and academic support for temporary new employees, but then you'll also have separate employees that are hired as permanent employees, so you'll be doing both? The idea?
So I don't know if you want to weigh in from the finance end, but most of our initiatives that we're looking at with the federal funding are not people, or if they are people, if it's hiring people, we've got to be very clear that these are temporary positions. So I don't know if that answered your question.
If it's not people, what will it be?
Well, I will add about the positions that are included in the county ask. You might recall that.
Can you speak louder, please?
Yes, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, as it relates to the social and emotional support positions that are included as a part of the county ask, you might recall that we have been using a phased-in approach to get our numbers to where it would be improvement, an improvement to our ratios, students to those positions. And we still haven't gotten to where we were with the initial plan with that. So that's a part of things that were in effect before COVID actually hit. So that's what's included as a part of the county ask.
Okay, so.
Chairman Dunlap, we realized there were a couple of questions that we did not have an opportunity to answer. One was around MTSS. Also, I think Commissioner Leek had a question about recruitment as it particularly relates to African Americans and African American males.
Can't hear you, doctor.
I was sharing with Commissioner Leek with Chairman Dunlap if we could have an opportunity to address some of those questions, if you're okay with it. I just...
No, well, what I'm going to tell you is that I've already allotted for us to go over. We should be in another closed session at 4 and another closed session at 5. So by extending this, let me just ask you to put the responses to those questions in a detailed report, because there will be additional questions presented to you that you won't be able to answer today as well. All right, Commissioner.
Thank you. But was Commissioner Altman's asking about MTSS? Yes, ma'am. So we'll make sure that we address that when we come back.
Thank you, sir.
I have that question as well, so if you could send it to all of us, that would be helpful. The first thing I want to say is thank you for the thoroughness of this report. It's very helpful, and like my colleagues have said, I know we have all suffered through COVID. I feel like you guys suffered more than most people could possibly imagine going through. So thank you for sticking in there. Thank you for being here. Thank you for all the work that you do to help educate our children. I really appreciate it. When Chairperson Dashu was talking about the tornado ripping the roof off, I feel like the house was falling apart before the tornado ripped the roof off. And so when we get some COVID dollars, and hopefully it's mixed throughout your budget request, I think that there's a reason that addressing learning loss is going to be 20%, and I want to know, how are you going to decide, like, how do you have to prove there was learning loss to help a certain segment of the population? How do you know that, like, how are you going to decide where those dollars go for addressing learning loss? Because we already had an achievement gap. And so will this help? I don't know if you're understanding me.
I think I do, Mr. Superintendent. I think first, as we shared those measure of academic progress results, using those results and results that we have embedded in our curriculum to be able to identify students where going from one year to the next, that we're seeing larger levels of unfinished learning. I think as Commissioner Altman asked about MTSS is a framework that we use, and part of that framework and part of the diligence which we're trying to build the muscle to, as we're not where we need to be or should be, and that the results we shared, and I want to thank Commissioner Link for hosting a meeting where we were able to share some results that some of her delegates asked for some information, is too few % of our students are still getting those supplemental or intensive supports. But we have to use the data that we have now to be able to say which students are in need of the most intensive supports, which students need those supplemental supports, and be able to put those things in place, which we're working diligently to do.
Thank you. And I don't want to lose my time, but I love that you requested the behavior and support centers. And I'm wondering why there isn't a test pilot in elementary school. Whoever wants to, and you can email me the answer if that's what you want to do, but I love the idea of that. I think that if we can do that, help children feel supported in school, I think they're much more likely to succeed and to believe in themselves.
All right, Madam Clerk, strict attention to this 2-minute time limit, because we're already behind, and I'm going to ask each of my colleagues to comply when you have the timer go off. Commissioner Jarrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of follow-ups, and I'll ask them both and then allow you guys to address. The first part that I want to talk about is equity and the application of equity. So in the community, we continue to use the term equity. We talk about it, we understand what it is, we see all the visuals that support it. Will you all help us understand how this money will be used and how you will apply equity with the funding? So literally, I guess from my perspective, and when I say my perspective, speaking for the people that I represent, if we had a number like we saw on page 63, I would suspect that we would have a tremendous amount of resources going to address those issues that are being experienced by those individuals. So I would just like to get some context around what the application of equity looks like from your perspective. I think that would be really helpful. The second question that I have that I'd like to know, when we were on slides 19, 20, 21, there were some funding dollars allocated around student wellness and academic support, technology, academics, health and safety. Will you give us a sense of how you all back into those numbers? So 43%, $43.7 million. I mean, what is that? What do these numbers represent? Student wellness, $4.8 million. Is it, have we identified a specific target population that we realize, and how long will this support those families or these individuals? How do you all back into these numbers that we're looking at, if you can help me understand that?
Commissioner Jarrell, I also want to acknowledge, and I didn't do a good job of this at the outset of our presentation, that we do have a team that is joining us virtually as well. and Dr. Katie Sincerity, who is our Executive Director of Federal Programs and is helping to shepherd this process of how we utilize those federal dollars that are coming our way due to the pandemic. I would like to invite Dr. Sincerity to chime in on your particular question.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak around this. So the slides that you saw that spoke about this is the ESSER $2. So this is one of the COVID-related funding sources. This was one that we were actually aware of throughout the budget process. We were made aware of these funds in November or December, which was really aligned with our overall budget process that we went through, that Superintendent Winston spoke about, where we worked with our focus area teams that provided the funding areas that were needed in order to meet student needs, where community feedback was provided throughout that process. And so in terms of how these were landed upon, it was really through that larger process with community feedback through those focus area teams. In doing that, any of the items that were lifted that were related to the prevention of, reduction of, or in response to COVID-19, that were also areas that could be done sort of as this like infusion for 1 year or for a few years. Those were the items that were identified to be a part of the CARESA funds or the ESSER II funds, this particular funding bucket. So I believe that answers the question.
Okay.
What's the second question?
Okay, I'm sorry.
Commissioner Giroux.
Application of equity was the other question.
So I'm going to turn to our Chief Equity Officer, but what I can share with you, Commissioner Giroux, is that in our strategic plan, one of our commitments is around equity. And when we talk about equity, we talk about it from the standpoint of making sure that we are providing all of our students access and opportunity, to a high quality education. We are also talking about from an equity standpoint, and I would lift up that our board has created an equity committee to help us in this endeavor. So they're providing guidance and advice around our equity efforts as well. But we, at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we're providing all students what they need to be successful. And I'm going to acknowledge that we still have work to do in that particular area. You also mentioned about I think Dr. Sincerity talked about the areas in which we've chosen to invest. Those areas, those priorities were set by our executive team. And then the focus area teams began their work to do a deep dive to tell us, okay, specifically within these areas, what type of things should we be investing in? So I just wanted to make sure I got back to that one as well.
And I think, Commissioner Jarrell, as a complement to what Superintendent Winston stated, I think on the one hand, it's a two-pronged approach, if you will, in each of the buckets, whether it be health and safety or academics. First, we need to raise the floor in particular areas to make sure there's some basics that are at every school. Superintendent Winston talked about standards aligned, culturally responsibly taught curriculum that will help our students so we're not remediating, we're actually teaching them at the grade level they should be taught. I know that might sound foundational and basic, but that's something that we're grappling with since we've instituted the Common Core as an industry across the country, but certainly here at CMS. But then that has to be complemented with a second prong, which is more deep investments where we've seen historical underservice and undersupport. So whether it be intentional investments at a set of schools in targeted areas that have been historically underserved to help them accelerate their improvement, or whether it be even use of things like the health and safety dollars to address HVAC issues and other facilities type issues. I think so we have a two-pronged approach. There's some things that are going to be systemically, because we know that in some instances, a universal treatment will have a disproportionate benefit. meaning when you make things better for everyone, that some students, particularly those who have been historically underserved, benefit at a greater rate. That's what the research shows. But we have to complement with that with targeted intensive areas, particularly where Black and brown and low-income students have been investing deeper in our English language learners and our EC students. I think it also has to come forward in what I would say is a complementary prong to those, which is more transparent monitoring for us internally, which Mr. Winston has been calling for and is an advocate for, and Ms. Dashew has been asked for too, around those subgroups. Although it was painstaking in our presentation at times, and I apologize, what we wanted to do was be transparent at the subgroup level to see where we were, and then be able to invest in those same ways in kind of that system-wide level, and then intensive investments in other areas. So when you talk about the application of equity through the dollars, I think that's what Mr. Winston, Superintendent Winston, is leading us to think about.
Equity is also identifying and dismantling barriers, and we've been committed to that since before the pandemic. I mean, that was a major focus of our strategic assignment review, and we changed the way magnet assignments work. We identified arbitrary barriers that were keeping brilliant students out of magnets who were able to thrive once we removed those barriers, once they were able to get into those magnets. So that's just one example. That's just one more example of how we keep equity at the forefront. But it's hard work. If there were a magic wand, we'd be using it, and every urban school district in the nation would be using it. So we're here for it, and we're grateful for the 40 members of the Community Equity Committee who are helping us tackle this work. And we welcome the partnership with you all as well, because in so many ways our work is interconnected when you look at how these systems are interconnected.
Okay, Commissioner Powell.
I think I'm going to email most of my questions and just say that we are interconnected, and I want to be part of problem solving, and I want to be part of working together. It's going to take all of us working on this together, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Let me just say, I appreciate the fact that you're looking to do something with the suspension rate. Anybody who's paid attention know that if kids are not in class, they can't learn. And I am happy to see that you've developed something to assist in that area. And then the other question I needed for follow-up is I'm not satisfied with the response that I got about the charter school student growth. What we know for a fact is the CMS student population has consistently gone down over a period of time. And there's not been an accounting for that in terms of the way we fund the budget. And now you're projecting that another 1,970 students will go to charter schools next year. And what I'm trying to figure out is you're asking for $7.6 million to fund that, but you're not accounting for the fact that that's a 1,900 reduction in CMS population that is currently being funded. So explain that to me.
So I can share that when we are estimating the growth in charter schools, there is a calculation there that, we can't predict the future, but we're just basically estimating based on the best information that we have at the time, the number of students that it's going to grow by, and assigning the cost to it, appropriately. I don't have more information that I can share with you about the change in our students. I know that we are making up the differences where we can with the federal funding, where we know we're going to lose positions. But as far as providing more detail, we may have to do that later. And I apologize, I don't have more information that I can share right now.
And the reason I say that, and I just give you a simple example. If we're funding student at $7,000 per student, and we talk about 1,000 students, that's $700,000. That's substantial.
Right.
And so I just need to have a better idea of how we do that. Okay, Commissioner Altman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll follow up by email.
All right, thank you. Commissioner Leek.
Thank you. We were talking about charter schools, and of that group of children that's not coming back, and we see a greater number of children going into charter schools are Black families. So it's saying something to Mecklenburg County in itself, and especially in some of our districts. Now, those of you who get upset with me because I talk about my district, that's why I'm elected, to represent them. And I will continue to do that. 49% black boys were never found this summer. The question is, what did you do to try to find these boys for school? You gave that number to us, 49%. The second thing was, the chairman said to us that you had reduced the level of requirement of courses for black kids. And we have that documented. So help me understand why 49% of our boys were not found. What did you do to find them?
I don't understand where that number is coming from. Do you understand?
Commissioner Leek, what I stated was that.
I'm sorry, what'd you say, sir?
What I stated was, in their goals and objectives, they had removed performance measures, which is what we had been accustomed to seeing on a regular basis. They said we will improve by a certain percentage, and there were all kinds of numerical numbers, like the percentage that would be on grade level or whatever.
I'm saying what they told us, Mr. Dunlap.
Okay, well, you said the chairman, so I wasn't sure who you were.
Not your chairman, but
Okay.
someone else. No, because we haven't had this kind of discussion. You all told us, and we were not able to do any dialoguing. So maybe you can send me the answer.
Okay.
Commissioner Leek, we'll commit to making sure you get that response in writing.
Thank you.
Commissioner Meyer.
Thank you. Chairwoman Dashu, you said earlier when I was asking questions, you said we are not a board of oversight, and that is a question we have to think about as this board. Are we a board of oversight? And we're not a board of oversight. We allocate money, and the numbers, I agree 100% with my colleagues, the numbers are tragic. And this is when we, as a board, we have to wrestle with this question on, are we a board of oversight? That's a rhetorical question. That concludes my comments.
If I could just respond, I just want to say that these numbers break my heart. They don't break my spirit, but they break my heart too. And I chose this work because I'm called to this work, and I think the same thing for Dr. Barnes and Superintendent Winston, and most, if not all of I think all of my colleagues on the school board. And so it's hard work, and we signed up for it. And we know that we're the face of these tragic numbers. But that doesn't mean we're going to shy away from it. That doesn't make it any easier to solve the problem. But as I said earlier, we are here for it.
All right, Commissioner McDowell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairwoman Dashu, for your comments. I really appreciate what you just said, and I think that's really important. And the fact that you guys are called to this work, I think is it's really, really hard, but I'm glad that you are, and I appreciate what you guys are facing and how you're facing it, and I want to be a partner in that, and so thank you. I do want to say to the manager that I want to be very, very careful, and I know you do as well, but that we are not putting ourselves in a position of funding things that we then have to fund and can never step back from. And that's what I learned in our last meeting, I believe it was in December, that, you know, once we fund things at a certain level, we can't go backwards. And that's what part of what I'm looking for and what we are going to do with the ask, is making sure, you know, that we're not putting ourselves in a position for next year and the year after and the year after. And I was really interested in page 14 with the state maintenance of effort provision that Superintendent Winston talked about, how you cannot use federal funds for state responsibilities. And so I really want to make sure that we're not using county funds for state responsibilities or federal responsibilities, because we have so many responsibilities of our own. But having said that, I definitely want to support CMS's efforts. So that concludes my comments.
All right. Having completed the agenda, Madam Chair, do you have anything you'd like to share before we move on?
I do not, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
All right. So at this time, I will entertain a motion to adjourn this meeting, and then I'll give you further instructions.
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Is there a
To adjourn.
All right, it's been moved. Who seconded?
Commissioner Jarrell?
Moved by Commissioner McDowell, seconded by Commissioner Jarrell. All those in favor, let's see by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposers? The ayes have it, so carries the motion. So this meeting is officially adjourned. We're going to allow 5 minutes for some transition to take place so that we can make sure that the only people present are people who will be entitled to a closed session, and then we'll come back and then offer a motion to go into closed session for our 4 o'clock meeting. Thank you.